Welcome back. We're talking about the politics of the Syrian refugee crisis. Still with us, Suzanne Meriden from the Syrian American Council. Stephen Yates is with DC International Advisory, an organization that advises on political risk and international business. And Alex Nowrasteh is the immigration policy analyst with the DC-based think tank, the Cato Institute. Suzanne, I want to continue with you. We just heard there from Paul Ryan, a leading member of the Republican Party here in the United States. When we hear this kind of rhetoric from people who are opposed to accepting the refugees into this country, are they not just reflecting the opinion of the majority of Americans? I mean, we look at one of the polls here that was conducted by Bloomberg. It said 53% of Americans say do not accept any Syrian refugees into the United States.
I think it's a little bit of fear-mongering, though, as well. I think what we saw here was the Paris attacks, which were very unfortunate. Officials quickly took that rhetoric of opposing refugees and began scaring the public. And the public is very vulnerable right now, I think, with the presidential campaign happening, with hearing about ISIS, et cetera. And that's why we keep saying we really need to go back and understand the story and how everything started and make sure people know exactly what's happening. That's why, actually, the Syrian American Council, we started this campaign of meet a refugee, and we sent invite letters to the governor saying, please take the time and meet with these people, understand their stories, understand why they fled in the first place. What we did was we took a story, made a big propaganda out of it, and forgot the human part of it. And that's what we're all about in the United States. We are about open doors. We're all refugees. I'm an immigrant here. We all come from that refugee makeup, and so it's unfortunate that we're taking to such deep places now and scaring the public. So it's time to go back and re-educate the public.
What about that, Stephen? Open the doors and listen to what the refugees have to say and get rid of the fear that's going around.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with the framing of this. I mean, the sense that there is no risk, I think, is false. There is a risk. When you're talking about having a pause for a time to review programs after you've seen something that gives you a reason for concern, that's rational. Speaker Ryan is not saying no refugees ever, but if we have, say, 100,000 good refugees and one person that does something awful, all that anyone for years to come is going to focus on is how did that one get in? And that's what elected officials have to live with. And so whether you're a candidate for office, you're a Speaker of the House, you're elected president, you have to live with that risk. And everyone arrives at that calculus differently. I think we have a lot of people with humanitarian compassion for those who come from other places. We are descendants of people who all come from different places. And that's a reality too. But that doesn't mean you ignore the risks. And we have people in politics, you're going through an election cycle, you have concerns. I can say as a chairman of a state political party, all around the state that I go to, there are people who raise concerns about this. And so elected leaders have to be able to reassure them. So to having a pause, giving some reassurance doesn't stop a program forever.
Alex, what about that? Elected leaders seem to be aware of what public opinion is all about. We have 31 governors in the United States all saying, this is the majority of governors in this country, saying that Syrian refugees would not be welcome in their states.
We should never, I think, make government policy when it comes to this crisis mode of thinking. What we have here is a response to a terrorist attack in another country not caused by refugees, as far as we have the data of. And the response in this country has been to close the door, or to try to close the door, on a handful of refugees from a particular country. It simply doesn't really make any sense. Now, a lot of these folks who are driving around these states and talking to governors and are confused, are concerned about the risk, took a far greater risk getting in their car that day, driving to meet people, to talk with them about it, than they ever face from terrorism, let alone from terrorism caused by refugees. So I think the problem is just a total innumeracy, the lack of any kind of scale that these problems are. Like, nobody is saying there's zero risk, nobody responsible anyway, and nobody is saying there's 100% risk. It's somewhere much closer to zero, though, and the risk is very, very slight, and we need to take that into account when we take a look at this, and not instead talk about 1 out of 100,000. It's instead, as I said, since 2000, 1 out of every 286,000 have been convicted, not committed an attack, but been convicted of planning an attack, and all 3 of those convictions were for planned attacks overseas.
Suzanne, what about Stephen's argument that, all you need is one guide among the 100,000 that come in?
You know, the problem with that argument is that we're really not showing any leadership on our part here, because we're saying this might happen and that might happen, instead of saying, listen, there is a crisis here. People are dying. People are having to go through treacherous waters. There, you know, no heat during the winter, no food for these people. They're stuck in places where they're not wanted. Instead of saying, let's come together, let's find a solution. We have a robust, a well-vetted system. Let's see how we can get them in. Let's see how we can work on making sure no insecurity takes place. We really have to show more leadership, and we've always done that in the past, and why we're lacking that leadership now is very difficult to understand. We really need to relook at this.
Stephen, what about the point made by a former US Undersecretary of State, Matthew Nimitz, who pointed out that the current US position is a little bit unfair when you look at all the other countries accepting these refugees? He says the US, quote, shares responsibility for the crisis, having played a role in triggering the unraveling of the Middle East through the ill-conceived invasion of Iraq and our failure to take early action in the Syrian debacle.
Well, I mean, he's taking essentially the typical Foreign Service, very partisan line about what the origin of the conflict is. I think it's impossible to say that the United States is in any way, shape, or form responsible for the Syrian civil war. We are certainly responsible for our interventions or lack of interventions over the course of the last 4.5 years. I think that a lot of the political reaction we're dealing with now doesn't occur in a vacuum. The fact that the president wrote a red line and it didn't have any follow-up, you can be for or against the red line, but the lack of follow-up had some consequences. The people who have a lack of confidence that the president has a clear vision about what our anti-ISIS campaign is and whether it's working, the fact of the matter is that Russia and France together, in a matter of a few days, have hit more targets in ISIS-controlled areas than the United States had in a year prior. And so the lack of confidence that we're making a meaningful difference to the root cause of the refugee crisis makes people hesitant about, if we take more now, what are we doing to resolve the problems at the origin?
Okay.
And right now, I think we have to wait for new leadership in the United States.